Shares. अच्छा जी. Assalamu alaikum and very good morning to all of you. A rainy morning, very good rainy morning to all of you. I hope and pray that all of you are well, enjoying Ramzan, which is almost. क्यों जी आवाज नहीं आ रही क्या हुआ आवाज हाँ जी अस्सलाम alaikum and very good morning.
मैम आपके पास एंट्री नहीं है एंट्री वगैरह चल रहा है पता नहीं
हाँ जी अस्सलाम alaikum.
शेयर
हाँ जी अस्सलाम alaikum. हाँ जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम। आ गई है आवाज? अस्सलाम वालेकुम and a very good morning to you people. A very rainy morning यहाँ पे तो, and I'm sorry about this delay. Somehow the system keeps on giving problems. It creates a lot of problems. So you must be surprised by now. Today, instead of embryology, I'm going to take a gross anatomy class. इसलिए क्योंकि I want to complete the syllabus myself. I don't want to hand it over to anybody. और इसमें कुछ चीज़ें हैं जो I need to discuss with you personally. थोड़ा सा उसको they are very important, so I'll mention them as we go by. Your substage is on the 19th, coming Tuesday. ठीक है, coming Tuesday, first substage head and neck. उसमें ये सब कुछ शामिल है. So we finished off with the nerve supply of the face and scalp, and now we do the blood supply, the arterial supply to begin with. The superficial arteries of the face, they come from, to begin with, the temporal artery, superficial temporal artery. But this is the superficial temporal artery. It is a branch of the external carotid artery. Okay? It arises, yes, superficial temporal. It arises between, this is where the air should have been, external auditory meatus है. This is the external auditory meatus, this is the temporomandibular joint. So in between the temporomandibular joint and the external auditory meatus, this is the site where the external carotid artery, ये सारी external carotid है. This is the site where the external carotid artery gives off the superficial temporal branch, which is a terminal branch of the external carotid artery. This is the smaller of the two branches. There are two terminal branches of the external carotid. मतलब जब external carotid end करती है, तो it ends by dividing into two branches. ये जो है, this is that I showed you is the superficial temporal, और ये जो है smaller branch, this is the maxillary. ये इसकी दो terminal branches हैं, ठीक है? Now, as it arises from the external carotid artery, it crosses the zygomatic arch. ये zygomatic arch, ये सारी zygomatic arch. So it crosses the zygomatic arch and enters this temporal fossa. आपको पता है, this is the temporal fossa. So it enters the temporal fossa where it divides into two branches, an anterior branch and a posterior branch. We call them a frontal branch because it goes to supply the frontal bone, the frontal sinus, and this is the parietal branch or the posterior branch. इसकी distribution exactly follow करती है the distribution of the auricular temporal nerve. ठीक है? So the branches of this artery follow the branches of the auricular temporal nerve. Now, arising from the superficial temporal artery, this is the superficial temporal, dividing into two terminal branches, frontal or anterior branch and a posterior branch or a parietal branch. Arising from the superficial temporal artery, we have this artery. This is the transverse facial artery. Okay? It arises within the, it arises within the substance of the parotid gland. So this is the parotid gland. Okay? This entire thing is the parotid gland and this is the parotid duct. So This is a superficial temporal. This is a transverse facial arising from the superficial temporal in the substance of the carotid gland. It crosses this muscle. ये जो muscle है इसको masseter कहते हैं, one of the muscles of mastication. So please note it crosses the masseter inferior to the, this is where the zygomatic arch should be. So below the zygomatic arch crosses the masseter muscle, okay, and then divides into multiple branches. These branches supply, number one, the parotid gland. This parotid gland, it supplies the parotid duct. It also supplies the masseter muscle. It supplies the skin of the face, overlying skin जो है उन सबको करती है. And at the terminal end, it divides. It anastomoses with the facial artery. This is the facial artery. Please note this is a very tortuous artery. Straight नहीं है. Zigzag सी इस तरह है. So ये जो आपकी transverse facial artery है, this divides anastomoses with the branches of the facial artery. अच्छा जी, अभी तक तो हमने डिस्कस की थी the branches of the external carotid. Okay, now let's come to these two branches that supply the forehead. They are the supraorbital and the supratrochlear. बिल्कुल जिस तरह आपकी supraorbital and supratrochlear की nerves थी. Exactly वही distribution है. The difference is now these this medial is the supratrochlear. यहाँ पे ये देख लीजिए ये supratrochlear and laterally placed is the supraorbital. ये lateral वाली जो है ये supraorbital है. Sorry, I'm so sorry. और बेटा also note that this is the superficial temporal artery. Okay, this is the branch of external carotid. अब ये जो supraorbital और ये medially जो supratrochlear है, ये जो है ये supraorbital है laterally placed और ये supratrochlear है which is medially placed. These two branches accompany the nerves, supraorbital nerve, supratrochlear nerve. ठीक है? These two arteries are branches of ophthalmic artery, or ophthalmic artery is a branch of internal carotid. ठीक है? So both these arteries, supraorbital, laterally, supratrochlear medially, are branches of ophthalmic artery, which in turn is a branch of internal carotid. और ये जो दोनों arteries हैं, ये you can see it over here. They are anastomosing with the superficial temporal. Branches of superficial temporal. Superficial temporal is a branch of external carotid. Okay, so over here you have an anastomosis between branches of external carotid from superficial temporal and internal carotid from supraorbital and supratrochlear, mainly supraorbital. Okay, so this is a site of anastomosis between external carotid and internal carotid artery. अब इनका area of supply क्या है? Exactly वही जो nerves का था. Meaning that the supratrochlear artery, the medial one, okay, this supplies the forehead in the midline strip in the forehead as far as over here, where the hairline is or it should be. यहाँ तक, ठीक है? It should be, I'm saying, because there are people who do not have hairline, people who are bald. Obviously उनकी hairline तो नहीं है तो कहना मुश्किल है, but God knows and this blood vessel knows this is how far it should be. It supplies. And then comes the supraorbital, the laterally placed artery. It goes as far as the vertex. Vertex you all know, is the highest point on the sky over here. So supraorbital goes as far as this, up to the vertex. And then comes the mental artery. I'm sorry, once again. This is the mental artery. Okay? The mental artery is a branch of the maxillary artery. ये maxillary artery, this one. And it is coming from here. The inferior alveolar, and the inferior alveolar comes out of the mental foramen in the mandible and is distributed to the chin. This area where it emerges from the mental foramen, this is the area where it gets distributed. Okay, so please remember that this is a site, forehead is a site of anastomosis between superficial branches of superficial temporal and branches of supraorbital and supratrochlear. Superficial temporal from the external carotid system and supraorbital and supratrochlear from internal carotid system. Ophthalmic की branches हैं from internal carotid. अच्छी जी. Now अब venous drainage की आ रही है. बेटा आपकी examination point of view से, practical point of view से, in practical life, this venous drainage is extremely important. ठीक है. मैंने applied anatomy की separate slides नहीं बनाई, but I am discussing applied anatomy with you as we go by. Okay, so so let's come to the venous drainage. बेटा venous drainage, एक बात तो याद रखिए, venous drainage accompanies the arteries. ये एक basic बात है. The veins of the face accompanying the arteries of the face. Please note this vein is straight. This is the facial vein. ये एक straight vein है in contrast to the facial artery. I showed you the facial artery. That was a very tortuous artery. ठीक है. अच्छा. Now इसको अब आप देखिए. एक बात तो आप याद रखिए venous drainage of face में कि जो the veins of the face do not contain valves. They are valveless. ठीक है. और दूसरी चीज ये है कि जो superficial veins है ना, the problem with these superficial veins is that they anastomose with deeper veins. मैं आपको दिखा देती हूँ. They are anastomosing with deeper veins. They are anastomosing with venous sinuses. They are anastomosing with venous plexuses. ये venous plexus है, ये dural venous sinus है, और ये deeper veins है. So जो veins of the face है, despite being superficial, लेकिन उनके बहुत से deeper connections भी हैं, which are clinically very important. And please, once again, these veins do not contain valves. अच्छा जी, पहले सुपरफिशियल वीनस ड्रेनेज करते हैं. ठीक है. अब जिस तरह हमने अभी डिस्कस किया था सुप्राऑर्बिटल एंड सुप्राट्रोकियर आर्टरीज, इनकी अकम्पनिंग वेन्स भी हैं. The medially placed is the supraorbital, the medially placed is supratrochlear vein. The laterally placed is supraorbital vein. These two veins, they join together and make up the angular vein. I repeat once again, supraorbital and supratrochlear veins join together make this vein, which is the angular vein. Sorry, 8 seconds. Let me go back for a minute. अच्छा, सॉरी, मैं एक स्लाइड बीच में मिस कर गया. ठीक है, एंड दिस इज अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट स्लाइड जो मैं आपको दिखाना चाहती हूँ, एंड दैट इज द फर्स्ट स्लाइड ऑफ द arterial supply. The main arterial supply is from the facial artery. Here, this is the facial artery. Please note ये बड़ी tortuous सी artery है. ठीक है. अब ये जो facial artery है ना, it is a branch of external carotid given out from close to the angle of the mandible, and from there it jumps onto the inferior border of the mandible, crosses the inferior border anterior, ये देखिए inferior border of the mandible, it crosses the inferior border lying anterior to the masseter. ये masseter muscle है बेटे, and this is the anterior border of the masseter muscle. So it crosses the it crosses the inferior border of the mandible, comes to lie anterior to the masseter muscle, and then it crosses the mandible. उस पे से गुजर गई, ये देखिए, it crosses the mandible. In doing so, it is also crossing this muscle, which is the buccinator, and it is lying deep to the zygomaticus major muscle. ठीक है, running over the maxilla. अब यहाँ पे सारा maxilla है, and in doing so, it is lateral to the angle of the mouth. ये mouth, this is the angle of the mouth. It is lying about a finger's breadth lateral to the angle of the mouth, and then it ascends and comes to lie at the lateral wall of the outer surface, lateral wall of the nose. ये देख लीजिए. This is the nose. This is the lateral wall of the nose. It is running along the lateral wall of the nose. In this situation, where it is on the side wall of the nose, it gives off an artery, which is the lateral nasal artery. Here, the facial artery gives off the lateral nasal artery on the side wall of the nose over here. But this lateral nasal artery is important because it anastomoses with another artery, ये देख लीजिए यहाँ पे, which is the dorsal nasal artery. So the lateral nasal artery anastomoses with the dorsal nasal artery, which is a branch of ophthalmic. I repeat once again, lateral nasal artery is a branch of facial. Facial is a branch of external carotid. This facial artery gives off lateral nasal artery. Lateral nasal artery, this anastomoses with the dorsal nasal artery. Dorsal nasal artery is a branch of ophthalmic, और आपको पता है ophthalmic जो है, that is a branch of internal carotid. So this once again, lateral wall of the nose, once again becomes a site where external carotid and internal carotid they anastomose, site of anastomosis of external and internal carotid. So we were talking about the facial artery. But as the facial artery ascends, it gives off lateral nasal artery. Okay? Beyond the lateral nasal artery, now this this artery is called angular artery. Now the facial artery changes its name to angular artery. In fact, ये जो angular artery है, ये इसका terminal part है. So the facial artery terminates as the angular artery, which runs up to the medial canthus of the eye. The eye, ये medial canthus है, ये lateral canthus है. So it runs along up to the medial canthus of the eye. ये हमने कर लिया. Superficial temporal, transverse facial भी हो गई थी, supraorbital, supratrochlear भी हो गई. अब कंपनी में वेन्स की बात कर लेते हैं. अच्छा जी, सुपरफिशियल वीनस ड्रेनेज की हम बात कर रहे हैं. beta superficial venous drainage. The supraorbital vein laterally, supratrochlear vein medially. They join together, form the angular vein. Up, as I said in the beginning, these veins accompany the arteries. So superficial veins of the face, they accompany the artery. अभी हमने बात की कि the facial artery की terminal branch थी angular artery. ठीक है, so ये फिर उसी को देख लीजिए. Now supraorbital, supratrochlear veins on the forehead join together, and at the ये eye है इसका medial canthus. At the medial canthus of the eye, the two veins join together and form the angular vein. Now, as it descends, अब यहाँ पे ये orbit है, lower margin of the orbit. At the lower margin of the orbit, this vein changes its name to facial vein. अभी तक यहाँ पे angular vein थी. At this level, at the lower border of the orbit, it changes its name to facial vein. The facial vein follows a straight course. Unlike the facial artery, जो कि बहुत tortuous थी, this is a straight vein. It runs as far as the mandible, lower border of the mandible. ये देख लीजिए, ये mandible का lower border है, so it runs as far as the lower border of the mandible. ये at the lower border of the mandible, it is joined by the anterior division of retromandibular. बेटा ये retromandibular vein है, इसकी दो terminal tributaries हैं, posterior and anterior. The anterior जो है, anterior की tributary जो retromandibular की है, this joins with the facial vein to form a common facial vein which drains into the internal jugular vein. ये internal jugular है. This is the internal jugular. So the retromandibular dividing into a posterior and anterior tributary. Anterior tributary of the retromandibular joins the facial vein, and together they form a common facial which drains into internal jugular. ये देखिए यहाँ पे ये दूसरा दिखाया है आपको, facial vein at the lower margin of the mandible. अब ये this is the retromandibular anterior division, posterior division. The anterior division of the retromandibular joins the facial vein to form a common facial vein which drains into this thicker vein which is the internal. अच्छा जी, अब दूसरे एंड पे आ जाइए. दूसरा एंड है कि the superficial temporal vein. This is the superficial temporal. The superficial temporal vein joins with this vein which is the maxillary vein. The maxillary vein actually comes from the pterygoid venous plexus. This is the pterygoid venous plexus. ठीक है, अभी के लिए नाम याद रखिए, मैं अभी आपको ये करवा देती हूँ, सारा करवा देती हूँ. So this is the pterygoid venous plexus, a plexus of veins which is lying around the lateral pterygoid muscle. ये ठीक है. अच्छा, now the pterygoid venous plexus is drained by this vein. This vein is the maxillary vein. Okay? The maxillary vein joins this vein which is the superficial temporal vein. These two join together and make this vein which is the retromandibular. I repeat once again, Pterygoid venous plexus drained by maxillary vein. So the maxillary vein from pterygoid venous plexus is joined by the superficial temporal vein, which drains the side of the head and scalp. Temporal area को drain करती है. The superficial temporal and the maxillary vein from the pterygoid venous plexus joined together form the retromandibular vein. The retromandibular vein has two divisions, the anterior division here and a posterior division. The anterior division joins with the facial vein to form this common facial vein, which drains into the internal jugular vein. IJV is internal jugular vein. Okay? Then coming to the posterior division of retromandibular की posterior division भी है, something that we haven't mentioned so far. इस posterior division में ये देखिए, this is posterior division is joined by this vein. This is the posterior auricular vein. Okay? So the posterior auricular vein joins the posterior division of retromandibular to form this vein, which is the external jugular vein. I repeat once again, the posterior division of retromandibular vein joins with the posterior auricular vein to form the external jugular vein. The external jugular vein, this is the external jugular vein. यहाँ पे दिखा देती हूँ, posterior auricular joins with the posterior division of the retromandibular vein to form the external jugular vein, and external jugular vein terminates into the subclavian vein. ये subclavian है, the external jugular vein ending in the subclavian vein. अच्छा जी, so अभी हमने mention किया था कि the problem with the venous drainage of the face is कि it communicates with venous sinuses, it communicates with venous plexuses and deep veins. पहले let me make you familiar with things. ये बेटा, this is the cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus is one of the sinuses that is lying in the meninges, dura में. आपको पता है brain की is covered by fibrous sheets. These coverings of the brain are called meninges. ठीक है? और तीन meninges हैं from outside in. The outermost is dura mater, middle one is arachnoid matter, and the innermost is pia mater. So the brain is over here is covered by three coverings of fibrous connective tissue. These three coverings or three membranes are called meninges collectively, और इनके नाम हैं, outermost is dura mater, the middle one is arachnoid matter, and the inner one directly in contact with the brain is the pia mater. Now, these dural venous sinuses, we'll do them inshallah. These dural venous sinuses are lying within the dura. Dura की दो layers है, ठीक है? So lying within the two layers of dura. बाकी single layers हैं. Pia भी single layer है, arachnoid भी single layer है. Dura double layer होता है, and lying between the two layers of the dura mater we have these venous sinuses, dilated veins. And this is one of the dilated veins present most anteriorly, okay, on either side of the body of sphenoid. We'll do this later on. So this is the cavernous sinus. This is the eye. Okay. The eye is drained by this vein, ophthalmic veins. Superior ophthalmic vein, inferior ophthalmic vein. Okay. they drain the eye. अब और सिर्फ यही नहीं, प्रॉब्लम है इसका, ये जो सुपीरियर और इंफीरियर थैलेमिक वेन्स है ना, they drain into the cavernous sinus. You can see them going. They drain into the cavernous sinus. Now, प्रॉब्लम दूसरा बड़ा ये है कि ये जो फेशियल वेन है ना, to begin with over here, the angular vein, this communicates with the superior ophthalmic vein. So the facial vein, this angular vein, ye anastomoses with the superior ophthalmic vein, and the superior ophthalmic vein goes into the cavernous sinus. ठीक है. दूसरा, once again, the inferior ophthalmic vein. This also communicates with the facial vein. ठीक है. And now this inferior ophthalmic vein is going to the cavernous sinus, all right. But on its way to the cavernous sinus, it gives a vein, a tributary, that anastomoses with this pterygoid venous plexus. मैं फिर repeat करती हूँ. Inferior ophthalmic vein joins the facial vein at one end, and it drains, the inferior ophthalmic vein in itself drains into the cavernous sinus, and it also gives a branch that drains into the pterygoid venous plexus. So इस inferior ophthalmic vein के through the pterygoid venous plexus, through this communicating vein, also communicates with the cavernous sinus. ठीक है. अभी तक do you have any questions? Any questions बेटा? अच्छा चलो ठीक है. If there are no questions, अगर सारा समझ में आ रहा है तो this is fine. That's very good. So हम बात कर रहे थे deep venous anastomosis. Now what happens is कि from the posterior surface of the facial vein, you have this vein, which is the deep facial vein. This deep facial vein connects the posterior surface of the facial vein to the pterygoid venous plexus. Or pterygoid venous plexus is connected to the inferior ophthalmic vein and then into the cavernous sinus. It even directly communicates with the cavernous sinus here through this vein, going behind this bone. So the pterygoid venous plexus directly also communicates with the cavernous sinus through an emissary foramen. ठीक है. अच्छा. अब so I told you कि ये जो deep facial vein है, it connects the posterior surface of the facial vein to the pterygoid venous plexus. अब उसका रिजल्ट क्या होगा? Think about it for a minute कि इसका रिजल्ट क्या हो सकता है. देखो बेटा, बात ये है, if you block this vein over here, ठीक है, कोई infection or a thrombus, anything, the vein gets blocked over here. Now blood is draining down. इधर से drain करके it is going over here. So you have a blockade over here. यहाँ पे ये arrow है. As a result, कि blood will not drain, ठीक है, will not come down. These veins do not have valves, resulting कि यहाँ से the blood will go back. It will remain over here or it will travel back. When it travels back, it can go into the inferior ophthalmic vein. वहाँ से it will go into pterygoid venous plexus, or it can go from the superior ophthalmic vein directly into the cavernous sinus, or the blood can go via the inferior ophthalmic vein to the cavernous sinus and also into the pterygoid venous plexus. Now, if this thrombus was formed because of any infection in this area, any infection in this area can produce a thrombus. So that means that blood के साथ that infection is also traveling via the inferior ophthalmic vein into the cavernous sinus, also into the pterygoid venous plexus. This infected thrombus or infection via the superior ophthalmic vein can go directly into the cavernous sinus. In both the cases, the infection is very likely to enter the cavernous sinus. This condition produces a thrombus in the cavernous sinus. The condition is called cavernous sinus thrombosis. It is an extremely dangerous condition to have. Okay, so that is why this area where you have the facial vein up to the upper lip, ये सारा area जो है, this is the area called danger area of the face. ही हम बात भी करेंगे because any infection, any boil, any pustule, कोई भी दाना जो निकल आता है इस area में from the root of the nose to the upper lip, ये triangular area जो है, this area is called danger area of the face. यहाँ पे कोई दाना निकले, कोई boil निकले, कुछ हो, please do not scratch it. Please do not try to uh, burst it. कुछ नहीं करना, उसको फोड़ना नहीं है दाने को. Let it remain where it is. अच्छा जी, before we go ahead, before we go any further, do we have any questions? बच्चे any questions? I suppose not. अब प्लीज एक बात याद रख लीजिए, ये जो deep venous anastomosis है, this is extremely important. Danger area of the face is extremely important. From your examination point of view, बहुत question कम है, very common question. ठीक है? अच्छा, मैं superficial venous drainage repeat कर देती हूँ. Arterial supply ठीक था? Was the arterial supply okay? Any problems regarding the arterial supply? I guess not. अच्छा, मैं repeat कर देती हूँ बेटा. I was just wanting to find out about, do you have any problems regarding the arterial supply, बेटा? Let me go back. Superficial venous drainage of the face. Okay. Venous drainage of the face की बात कर लेते हैं. मैंने आपसे कहा था कि venous drainage of the face is एक तो इसमें variations बहुत ज़्यादा है. ठीक है, हम general जो common pattern होता है, we're talking about that common pattern. ठीक है. दूसरी बात ये है कि ये जो superficial veins है ना face की, they are communicating with the venous sinuses. ठीक है, they are communicated with venous plexuses, ये pterygoid venous plexus. They are also communicating with these deeper veins. ठीक है. अब the most dangerous thing is that these veins do not have valves. Superficial veins of the face, all the veins of the face do not have valves. सिर्फ यहाँ पे external carotid जब बनती है, उसकी termination पे valve होता है. The rest, all these veins are valveless. Superficial veins of the face की बात करते हैं. देखो बेटा, the supraorbital laterally and supratrochlear medial part of the forehead. ये दोनों forehead की veins है. They accompany the supraorbital and supratrochlear arteries. Plus, they also accompany the supraorbital and supratrochlear nerves. So, the supraorbital and supratrochlear arteries, they join together, form the angular vein. Sorry, arteries नहीं, veins की बात कर रहे हैं. supratrochlear and supraorbital lateral tuberosity. These two veins join together to form this vein, which is the angular vein. ये बिल्कुल एंगुलर आर्टरी के साथ चलती है और आपको पता है कि एंगुलर आर्टरी थी वो फेशियल आर्टरी की टर्मिनल ब्रांच. So now we have this angular vein. This is the angular vein formed by the union of supratrochlear and supraorbital veins. This angular vein runs down and at the level of inferior border of the orbit, this angular vein changes its name to facial. So इस level पे inferior border of the orbit के level पे the angular vein changes its name to facial vein, and the facial vein is a straight vein. This is in sharp contrast to facial artery जो कि बड़ी zigzag tortuous किस्म की थी. ठीक है, so this facial vein goes straight down to the level of lower border of mandible. At this level, the facial vein is joined by the anterior branch या anterior division of retromandibular vein. I repeat once again. Supratrochlear and supraorbital join together, form angular vein. Angular vein runs down as the facial vein. Facial vein continues as far as the lower border of mandible. इस level पे the facial vein is joined by the anterior division of the retromandibular. This is the retromandibular vein. इसकी दो terminal divisions हैं, posterior division और anterior division. Anterior division of the retromandibular joins the facial vein to form this structure, which is the common facial vein that ends into this thick vein, this wide board. This is the internal jugular vein. यहाँ पे फिर दिखा देती हूँ. This is the retromandibular. दो में divide की posterior division, anterior division. Anterior division of the retromandibular joins this facial vein to form the common facial vein, or the common facial vein enters into the internal jugular. ये external jugular है, इसमें नहीं. ठीक है, अभी इसकी formation पढ़ते हैं. ये एक दूसरा व्यू है इसका. दूसरी एंड पे देखिए, let's come to this superficial temporal, draining the temple side of the head. The superficial temporal veins join the maxillary vein. अब ये जो maxillary vein है, this is coming from, you're draining the pterygoid venous plexus. ये pterygoid venous plexus है, lying around the lateral pterygoid muscle. This pterygoid venous plexus से एक vein निकलती है जो उसको drain करती है pterygoid venous plexus में. This vein is called the maxillary vein. The maxillary vein joins the superficial temporal vein to form the retromandibular vein. ठीक है? This retromandibular vein is lying within the substance of the parotid gland. ठीक है? So जब हम parotid gland के आपने contents पढ़े थे, structures lying within the parotid gland, तो superficial से deep चलें तो you have the facial nerve, the retromandibular vein, and the external carotid artery in this particular order from superficial to deep. Coming back to the venous drainage, the maxillary vein draining the pterygoid venous plexus is joined by superficial temporal vein to form the retromandibular. The retromandibular divides into two, an anterior division that joins the facial vein and forms the common facial, which drains into internal jugular. The posterior division of the retromandibular is joined by the posterior auricular vein that drains the area behind the auricle. So posterior auricular vein joins the posterior division of retromandibular vein, and the two together form this vein, which is the external jugular vein. And this external jugular, यहाँ पे देख लीजिए, posterior auricular joining the posterior division of retromandibular. ठीक है? And they make the external jugular. The external jugular ends in the subclavian vein. ये subclavian vein. ठीक है? Okay. Now, do we have any questions before I move ahead? Please, if there are, abhi clear kar lo, because this is an extremely important topic. I guess not. Okay. Gee. Okay, you're welcome, my dear. You're most welcome. Always welcome. Actually. So now we move ahead. Lymphatic drainage. ये once again एक बहुत important है. एक तो बात ये याद रख लीजिए कि there are no lymph nodes, lymphatic channels जरूर है, but there are no lymph nodes in the scalp. ठीक है? So if you scratch your head or try to feel any lymph nodes, you will not find. So lymph nodes का जो पहला group है वो at the junction of the head with the neck. That is where you find them. So अब जो lymphatics from the scalp, from the neck, from the face, etc., they drain into a superficial ring of lymph nodes. This superficial ring is called pericervical collar भी कहते हैं इसको. ठीक है? अब मैं वो आपको एक दफा दिखा देती हूँ. Submental, ये देख लीजिए. Under the chin ये submental है. Angle of the mandible पे ये submandibular है. So from the submental ये groups of lymph nodes है. Submental lymph nodes, submandibular lymph nodes at the angle of the mandible. ठीक है? Then you have these. They are the parotid lymph nodes. These parotid lymph nodes are also called pre-auricular lymph nodes because they are lying in front of the auricle. The auricle है ना बेटा कान, also called pinna. So in front of the auricle you have lymph nodes which are called pre-auricular lymph nodes. They form one continuous group. Okay, ये parotid lymph nodes हैं, and then you have pre-auricular lymph nodes. They form one continuous group. Then you have a set of lymph nodes lying on top of the mastoid process behind the auricle. These are called इसको posterior auricular कह लें या mastoid nodes कह लें, वो आपकी मर्जी है. And then last but not the least, you can see them over here. You can see them over here. ये जो हैं, these are called occipital nodes. मैं फिर repeat कर देती हूँ. Submental nodes, submandibular nodes, ठीक है? Parotid nodes या pre-auricular nodes, post-auricular nodes also called mastoid nodes, and then finally you have occipital nodes. ठीक है? Now the thing to remember is कि इसमें जो superficial lymphatic vessels है ना, they run with the veins. जबकि जो deep lymphatic vessels हैं, they run with the arteries. And all these nodes, lymphatics from all these areas, ये, ठीक है? They end up in these nodes, which are ये वाले. These are called deep cervical nodes, and these deep cervical nodes are lying along the internal jugular vein. ये देख लीजिए, ये internal jugular vein है. You have these dark green nodes. These are the deep cervical nodes running along the internal jugular vein. From here, lymph then is carried to the jugular lymph trunk and then into the thoracic duct and drain into the internal jugular. वो सारा आपको पता है thoracic duct कैसे बनती है और कहाँ enter करती है. Just wanted to tell you this. अच्छा जी. So now do we have थोड़ा सा lymphatic drainage में आपको और बता दूं कि ये आप nodes ये drain क्या क्या करते हैं. So from the lateral part of the face, ये वाला part, and lateral part of the skull, ये temple का area. These are drain into these parotid nodes या preauricular nodes यहाँ पे, ठीक है. ये superficial parotid है. जो deep parotid nodes जो हैं, parotid that are embedded inside the substance of the parotid gland, वो lymph nodes, they drain into deep cervical, ये deep cervical, upper deep cervical में drain करते हैं, ठीक है. From the upper lip और lower lip का थोड़ा सा part, lateral most part, they drain into the closest, that is the submandibular nodes. और ये जो chin के nodes हैं, lymphatics from the chin and tip of the tongue, they drain into submental nodes. ठीक है. So from chin and tip of the tongue, submental में, upper lip पूरा and a small part of the lower lip. In fact, lower lip जो है, that also goes into submental. Lower lip, floor of the mouth, and apex of the tip of the tongue. Submental, submandibular node जो है, upper lip, small part of the side of the lower lip, side of nose, and anterior part of the tongue. ये submandibular में जाते हैं, ठीक है. So please ये आपको याद होना चाहिए कि ये कैसे ड्रेन करता है. और ये जो है, these are deep cervical lymph nodes lying along the internal jugular vein. Okay, so this finishes with the face and scalp. Any questions before I move on to the next topic? I suppose nahi hai. You won't have any questions. Okay, ठीक है. That's very good. Now let's do the next topic. अब हम infratemporal fossa पे आ गए. Infratemporal fossa की boundaries you've already done. So let's do the contents. Contents में से भी आपने you've done the muscles of mastication and you've done the maxillary artery. I'll do the rest of the contents in a temporomandibular joint. That's not a content, but it's an extremely important joint. बहुत पूछा जाता है practical point of view से, it is very important. The temporomandibular joint. देखो बेटा, temporomandibular joint is a modified type of pain joint. It is formed between the, अब ये mandible है, ठीक है, ये ramus of the mandible है, ये coronoid process of the mandible है, ये mandibular notch है, and this is the head of the mandible. Over here you have the neck of the mandible. So this joint is formed between the head of the mandible and this I told you was the temporal bone, and this is the temporal process. अभी zygomatic arch है, formed by the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone. So this is the temporal process of the zygomatic arch. इस temporal process of the zygomatic arch में एक तो ये fossa है जिसको mandibular fossa कहते हैं, and lying anterior to the mandibular fossa, this is a tubercle, articular tubercle है. This tubercle is part of the temporal bone. Mandibular fossa भी temporal bone का part है. So अब इस joint को देख लेते हैं. This joint is formed between the head of the mandible and the mandibular fossa lying in the temporal bone. Anterior limit is the articular tubercle है. Posteriorly, obviously, you have the structure just for styloid process and tympanic vein आ जाती है. अच्छा जी. अब आ जाते हैं. Every joint has a capsule, and so does this temporomandibular joint. The capsule of the temporomandibular joint is attached to the action. But like every joint is lined by lining of hyaline cartilage. Okay? This joint is atypical because The joint surfaces are lined not by hyaline cartilage, it is lined by fibrocartilage. The joint surface, that is why we call this joint TMJ is temporomandibular joint. That is why we call the TMJ an atypical joint, because the joint surface is lined by fibrocartilage. Actually. So the capsule of this joint is attached to the margins of the articular cartilage. अब ये जो टेम्परल बोन है, इस टेम्परल बोन के मार्जिन्स में लगा हुआ है, and the other end is attached to the neck of the mandible. ठीक है? Between the margins of the temporal bone and the neck of the mandible. This is how the capsule is attached. ये देख लीजिए, ये सारी joint capsule है. Now the joint cavity is divided into two by the presence of this disc, fibrocartilaginous disc. This disc is made of intra-articular disc lying inside the joint cavity. This disc is made up of fibrocartilage. Okay? This disc is attached on the inner side. ये देख लीजिए, ये जो blue है ना, ये disc है. This disc is attached. ये before I go any further, ये बेटा, this is the joint capsule. ठीक है? This is the joint capsule. Time हो गया?
जी मैम टाइम हो गया.
Okay, we'll continue with this next time. Thank you very much.